Good morning to our friends in the US. Good afternoon to our European friends who have joined this webinar today. My name is Martin Mahler. I'm the founder and the CEO of Astrato Analytics. And I'm really excited today to talk about a very interesting emerging topic that keeps being thrown around as a keyword, buzzword, which is the data mesh. We're entering a new era with data mesh, and I did some digging, and I wanted to kind of surface in a concise way on what it means self-service BI within the data mesh era. So with this, I'll get started. So it all starts effectively with terminology of self-service itself. So it has been around for many years, actually decades, actually when I started my career. And it's all about enabling the business to be able to be self-sufficient to work with ultimately data without dependence on IT. And whilst in principle self-service is well meant, what has emerged over the last 10, 15 years is a constant tug of war between IT and the business in every organization and almost any type of size that I have personally encountered as a BI consultant myself, then as a vendor, experiencing how people are organized and want to work with data. And the problem seems so easy and so obvious to solve, which is the business wants to have the data. They want to work with data. Why can't they get the data? Why is IT so stubborn or so slow or unable to provide the data or the dashboards or analytics in a shape and fashion that ultimately enables the business? It seems such an obvious problem that that there's no reason why it shouldn't be solved. But at the same time, right, we need to understand that there's actually two different responsibilities and accountabilities in our organization, whereas the business wants to move fast, but IT wants to ensure or needs to ensure that the data is in the right form, has the right quality, is governance and scalable. Because ultimately, if the business says, hey, the data is wrong, or the data doesn't work, or the dashboard fails, IT becomes responsible. So ultimately, by having these type of responsibilities, there's a constant pool of who has control over which side of the project. But the result of it is typically that they both end up frustrated. Sometimes they don't even talk with each other. Politics emerge. When all of them are working within the same organization, which seems almost not just counterproductive, but also, come on, it needs to be solvable. But it all boils down to its two fundamental elements, which is that users want to have the ability to freely explore the data at the right time versus IT wants to ensure that they have control. And because of that constant friction between those two power sides, it ended up with either scalability issues or perhaps also with technical debt or shadow IT emerging, which is ultimately slowing the organization down much more than effectively it helps. Now, self-service has been attempted. So it actually was the big promise of the BI technologies that I personally was part of with the introduction of Qlik, Tableau, and Power BI that ultimately did one thing very well. It took the data out of the warehouse. Because the data in the warehouse was inaccessible, it was slow, it was not moving fast, and it was also not able to add and include new data sets as they were emerging. Actually, BI did this job extremely well, that it took the data out and then enabled business teams, BI developers sitting within the business to ultimately deliver faster, more flexible, and in a much more dynamic way. And it obviously delivers value because it has great visuals, it's interactive, and easy to consume for somebody who is non-technical effectively. So that independence from IT is ultimately what this enabled. And anecdotally, for example, with Qlik, it was almost being used as its own data warehouse. So take with a QED structure, organization teams had the opportunity to create their own little warehouse within business teams. But again, this didn't solve the underlying problem because it created and it amplified the pain. So because ultimately with every extract that BI accomplished, ultimately become more flexible is where you had a data duplication, and let alone security or governance. It ultimately led to inconsistent metrics, different reload times, different extract times. Meant that different dashboards were even having different snapshots of the data, and ultimately, loss of trust. People could not trust the dashboards anymore, in particular when two dashboards were showing different type of data sets. And obviously this created a governance nightmare for IT. The BI developer left. There was a lot of flexibility with expression calculations that could be done. You could import a CSV file that was only available within a business team, and IT had no visibility over those elements. But somehow they became responsible ultimately to maintain and support these type of applications, which obviously, as you can imagine, supporting a application that you yourself have not designed, architectured, is an absolute nightmare, and it created more friction. I would like to highlight as well that even though it was flexible, delivered results, you still needed to do a lot of data modeling and data preparation and transformations within BI tools. So you need to join different tables, you need to write expression language. In the image here, I have an example of DAX, right, which shows that even though it's super powerful because it can meet certain analytical demands, it is actually not scalable because you still need power users. It is difficult to learn. There's an adoption curve, and ultimately even harder to maintain. Let alone all the changes that you're doing, you even don't know what the impact is ultimately on the quality of the output. So even though BI had a good success, I would say it has only achieved a fraction ultimately of its potential, and it's being used probably mostly, I would say, for executives, managers, and a fraction, I would say, of the workforce. When in reality, we should be giving data access to everybody within the entire organization and to frontline staff as well. But that's not possible with the current setup. Now, obviously, IT recognized this and see, look, there's a limit to how self-service BI was applied. So what is happening in organizations is actually the reverse. Instead of solving the underlying problems and finding a solution, they swing. So there's an internal cycle of change that I myself have been part of to experience, where a new CIO comes in, they see the debt, they see the business as having different versions of the truth and complaining about it. So they come with a great idea. We got to centralize everything. We're going to build a BI center of excellence. It's going to sit within IT. They're going to maintain it, consolidate dashboards and data pipelines, and ultimately serve the business. So ultimately, all that kind of capability moves centrally. And that works to some extent because it solves the governance problems and it improves the maintainability. But then the other side of the pain starts increasing, which is there's only so much capacity that the BI Center of Excellence has, and they cannot deliver to the demands of the business. They're not fast enough. They don't understand the context of the business because they're just sitting somewhere else, and they, quite frankly, also not frontline staff. So then the pendulum starts swinging the other direction, and that's where business teams start buying their own tooling, hiring their own BI developer that sits with them, and then shadow IT or federated BI teams start emerging, and governance start becoming again a pain. So a constant swing where every 4 to 5 years you go in one direction, then you go in the other, and everybody comes with a new idea. We should do it differently without solving the underlying pain, which is how do we marry the two functions together so they work well. Now, obviously, the pain hasn't been big enough to tackle this on a strategic level, but what is changing now is that with the explosion of data, especially in the cloud, the volumes, and ultimately also the velocity of data, there's no possibility anymore to have a centralized BI team serving the entire organization. There's just not enough workforce enabled to be able to do so. And at the same time, there's more and more need. So the pain is actually now around speed and agility is becoming even more measurable. And that is just on the technology side, let alone if we look at the business climate. I would say we have the highest business urgency we have ever experienced over the last couple of years. The economy moves fast, politics move fast, the environment moves fast, and businesses need to react extremely quickly, change their models, change their tactics, and they can only do so if they have access to their data, because that lays the foundation. And that can be, inflation, that could be tariffs that are being announced that are disrupting supply chains, or even technological disruptions, right? Gen AI changes business models, changes product lines, has impact. We need to be able to react fast, and you need data to do so. But how do you do so? How do you achieve that if the current reality most of the time looks like this? Lots of data sources, lots of data silos, different teams, not knowing who's responsible for which, let alone documentation, which I would say doesn't exist. And even though you may have, a BI tool or two BI tools in some cases, right? At the end of the day, users just get fed up, and all they do is they export it to Excel or their own preferred productivity tool, and they build their own localized analysis, which again, slow, who knows whether we can trust the data. And so there's a lot of time spent on that. So, and that renders organizations now, almost unable to move quick, and they become frustrated. So is there a solution to this? Is there a new approach? Well, actually, this is where it becomes quite interesting. So this is where data mesh comes into place, as alleged as a new golden standard. And as you can see on this image, on this architecture here, it encompasses somehow elements of both worlds. You see there are decentralized teams, finance is its own bubble, sales, marketing. However, it is all governed centrally within one infrastructure and one framework that underpins it all together. So it somewhat tries to take the best of both worlds, but tackle the pain points and the issues directly where they sit. So in concept, the data mesh is an architecture, a framework, but also an operating model. It starts treating data as products, which are not owned by IT anymore, but by the business domains that ultimately have the best understanding on the data they need, they want, and how they want to consume it, but on a common IT platform that is surfaced and managed by IT effectively in a central basis. And when I say IT platform, I don't just mean the technology, the infrastructure, but also governance, security, and guardrails ultimately on how the business can operate within it. Now, in a practical term, what does it mean? So I spent some time to kind of illustrate that on a diagram. So on an anatomy basis, the components are as follows. So you have ultimately many data sources, hundreds, sometimes even thousands, that ultimately, in order to achieve a successful data mesh, have to come and be stored in a single source of truth, ultimately. And that can be, a data lake. It could be, data lake in many formats, iceberg tables as three buckets, or it could also be more organized in a cloud data warehouse, for example, Snowflake or BigQuery or elsewhere. But the pure goal here is to centralize the data in a one single store effectively, where it can be accessed from within. And that is ultimately, what IT needs to manage and to get into a good position. Now, obviously, it doesn't end there, but on top of those single source of truth, raw data that you bring in, then business domains have the ability to build their domain data products. So data products can be anything from a simple table to a schema collection of tables, but ultimately it's a transformed, curated, cleaned data set that has a specific purpose to serve the business. And main goal is that this is also reusable, it's being maintained, and there's a clear data owner on that data product that sits within the business with the best understanding of that data. Now, those data products can then be consumed, but before we consume, there needs to be a semantic layer. And the semantic layer is a definitional layer where you can keep consistency around how you define terminology, around how you describe the business. Think revenue. Revenue means, even though it's a simple, obvious term, it means so many different things to different teams. Is it recognized revenue? Is it booked contracts for the sales team? Or is it annual recurring revenue, which is a forward-looking metric? We have to agree ultimately in order to be able to speak the same language. And this is where the semantic layer ultimately forms that platform to ultimately define the definitions. And those semantic layers can then later feed and be consumed by dashboards, many of them, right? One, reports, PDF reports, whichever they are, as long as they consistently feed of that semantic layer, or also, operational data applications, for data entry or workflows equal as much. What is important here is we're not just shifting different type of problems right or left, but we're splitting the responsibilities. So it's quite clear here that it starts with the business domain to start owning and managing the data products. It's no longer an IT problem. It is actually the business domain or the business data products who are responsible for maintaining, defining, and documenting the data products and the semantic layer. IT is responsible for providing the data, for ingesting it, of course, and making sure that all happens on a scalable, secure, and governed basis. But how the data is then being transformed for consumption is something that the business needs to own. This only works if you have a zero-copy architecture. And that is quite important. So in the example that I mentioned where BI took an extract away from a data source, that creates a lot of problems that ultimately exacerbate the governance issues that I spoke to about earlier. The way to solve it is to religiously abide towards a single source of truth, and that is only possible if you do not do copies of the data. So the data is stored in the cloud data platform. The data products could be a view or a materialized view, for example, and the semantic layer and the dashboards all query the data that sits in the cloud data platform throughout those abstraction layers to ensure that it's always the same single source. And that means different dashboards always report on the same data. If the data updates, it's immediately updated across the business domain, so you have timeliness and real time effectively. And last but not least, security is well done once at source and inherited across the business domain. So the business domain doesn't have to worry about governance and security, because that's being managed centrally effectively. I know this is very theoretical, but to apply a very practical example, and this becomes interesting, is perhaps to take a sales team within an organization. Now, they're extremely data hungry teams effectively, because the success and the performance of a organization is majorly being defined by how much revenue is the organization growing, how much are they producing, and how is it changing. So having full control and visibility of what is happening almost on a real-time basis is extremely critical to business decisions making. And this is where the sales domain needs to understand, okay, what is our sales performance overview at any given point in time? Now, the way they would work is they would work with IT to bring the CRM data into the cloud data platform, so to ingest it. Of course, it can be not just the CRM data, it could be a booking platform, it could be, many more technologies, and that's where it becomes interesting. And then together with IT team, define the data product. What is the sales pipeline? Clean it, remove any unapplicable rows or exclude columns that are irrelevant, or maybe even enrich them with more information so that it becomes consumable within the sales domain. Obviously, that is a collaboration between IT and the sales domain, or it could even be completely autonomous by the sales domain if I have a sales ops individual who's able to work with data as well. So there's, however, no dependency, hard dependency on IT in this case. They build their semantic layer, what is revenue, how do we define churn, and they can build their own dashboards that can then be easy for consumption for themselves, or they can also be accessible by other organizations, other functions in the organization who want to have an understanding of what the sales pipeline looks like. Now, to kind of reiterate on that, just to give you a practical example of how it could look like. So let's take as an example, maybe not sales, but let's take a marketing funnel. So funnel.io is a company that ultimately brings together and analyzes the web ad performance across different type of channels. And me as a marketing domain, I'm interested in building a data product out of it. So I would connect with IT to ingest the funnel data into a data store. Let's say this is Snowflake, but it could be anything else. And I come into ultimately what becomes the funnel.io data product, that is the collection of columns that are relevant, and we have checked it for accuracy, we have checked it for quality, and I'm happy, and I'm ultimately the one that is responsible for ensuring that this data product here is in a good quality and consumable. Now, in order to bring the data product to end users for consumption, I would need to use a visualization or a BI layer. And in this example, we're obviously using Astrato. And I have the ability from within Astrato to connect to the data source, and in this instance, browse perhaps all the available data products that I have access to, and see easily here that there's funnel.io. So the same data product here, but interfaced within the BI tool. In here, it is quite important, even though we have a lot of columns, we have not yet defined the semantic layer in here. And that is quite important. So one is the relationship between tables within a given data product, but also, there are many different lenses and views that we have when we're looking at the business domain. So when we're analyzing actually the funnel data, we're super important to understand organic, total impression, but also time periods are extremely important because we want to compare different periods with each other. So I have the ability here to define my semantic layer, my metrics, and other kind of definitions that are now relevant to the business. And once that semantic layer is completed, I can then see here that it feeds into, a few dashboards, but I can surface that into a application that is now sitting live and can be accessed by my team or others of the team as well. The important thing is that there is 100% direct lineage from the BI tool back into the cloud data source here. So I have trust in the data. If it updates, I can see the update directly happening in my dashboard. So I always see the latest version of the truth. And of course, I now also have the confidence that I can explore the data and it will be highly, of high quality effectively, either by slicing and dicing the dashboard or by building my own type of, individual report on the fly. Again, I trust the data. I know it's being maintained by the marketing team. I actually know who to go to if I have questions, but IT is not involved in that particular step. It's the business team. So that is an example within it. So moving on here, I described the marketing domain, right? The campaign performance product that I just illustrated. So we can have multiple domains that are working in parallel to each other, and will have the ability ultimately to build their own dashboards entirely self-sufficiently, whilst having confidence that the data quality and the trust is preserved. Now, where it starts becoming quite interesting, right? Because some of that what I've described is not necessarily groundbreaking, but what becomes groundbreaking and becomes quite interesting is when you start asking the real interesting questions in a business that do not necessarily sit with a single domain, but can go across multiple domains. So between marketing and sales, they are glued together because they are both impacting revenue. But there's a constant type of a lack of clarity. How much is marketing actually contributing to sales? And this is where attribution analysis comes into place. So I want to have understanding how much pipeline is the marketing team with their campaign actually producing for the sales team. And to get to that question, you would have to take the sales pipeline data product, you would have to take the campaign performance data product and build a new cross-domain data product using the two of those together. And that would be, for example, a marketing source pipeline, which could have a different set of metrics and a different semantic layer. How do we define cost per opportunity? What are the rules? What counts as an influenced lead versus not an influenced lead? And ultimately create a new dashboard here. Now, the interesting thing here is there's no IT involved in this process, because the marketing team can just go and use their own data product, and they can get access to the data product from the sales team and ultimately build a derivative new data product out of it and a new analysis in a dashboard. At any point in time, they will have full trust that whatever is visible in the lead to revenue funnel dashboard, it will be consistent with the sales performance overview, it will be consistent with the campaign performance dashboard, and it will all tie up together. In the old world, without a data mesh, I would have to create a new project, I have to create a new data set, I would have to get IT involved to produce that data set, and ultimately, at the end of the day, I would have to do a lot of validation to ensure that what I see on one dashboard is consistent with the other, but that is no longer necessary. So we eliminate a lot of steps, we increase the speed and the agility while maintaining trust, security, and governance, because the same security rules apply in the sales pipeline as also on the marketing source pipeline, because they are all inherited effectively. Now, this is two-dimensional, but where it becomes extremely powerful and a lot of value is unlocked is when you start rolling it out across the organization. Marketing, finance, product, operation, every function in the organization becomes its own business domain. You all of a sudden have the ability to elevate and do analytics in ways like never before. A customer 360 project and analysis that is simply spun up by connecting to the data products maintained by all the individual teams. Product analytics, what if you want to look at the financial performance, ROI calculation on budgeting and investments you're doing or planning? Or, if something new comes in, you would have immediate access on high quality and high trusted data to build new analytics in extremely fast fashion, again, without dependence on IT at all in this instance. And this ultimately unlocks, speed, agility, and whilst, maintaining the most important thing that IT wants to keep control of, which is governance, security, and also scalability of the infrastructure. So you mitigate the need for shadow IT, because this is actually quite fast. So how do you get there? Now, how do you get there ultimately without meshing it up? So it's quite easy, obviously, if you start with a clean blank of paper and you follow these rules. And this is also, quite frankly, what a lot of high growth technology companies are operating this way quite successfully. But how do you get there if you have been working in a different way before and you still have a tug of wars between IT and the business? Now, that transition is obviously never easy, but it starts on the BI side, super importantly, by shifting left. Now, this is a very important slide, and it illustrates a little bit, again, what made self-service legacy BI so good in the past? It was because it took the data away from the warehouse and IT dependency. It ingested it in, it created its own proprietary storage. You could put also your own files into it. So you create a little data silo that enables you to be fast and blend, for example, a spreadsheet together with a data set that you get from somewhere else. But it requires a lot of modeling, a lot of preparation, calculations. Ultimately, something. Ultimately, a scripting language like or expression language like DAX or set analysis is required to be able to do that data wrangling to ultimately get to a visualization into an analysis. And I remember personal experience, a lot of conversations that actually building a dashboard, the dashboarding part was always easy. What took 80% of the time was the ingestion, the storing, the modeling, the transformations, and all within a world that is quite proprietary to the specific knowledge and the skills of whoever was doing the BI project. Now, this, however, has become a liability. So the first step, and that is quite important, is to start by moving away all the business logic that is locked in your BI tooling into the data source. So anything that you're ingesting, you should never do in your BI tool. You should ingest it in your data store. You should also do all the modeling, all the transformations, and all the business logic that you're doing. The application of mapping and other things should always live in there. Not just to feed and make the BI visualization layer simpler and easier to use, because all it does is then becomes just an interface to quickly build dashboards and analytics on existing high quality data, but it's also to achieve the reusability, because then other technologies or other use cases can be met if the data sits within your cloud data platform itself. So that shifting left of BI is super critical. At minimum, it means, for example, to move QBDs into materialized into views, but it also requires a discipline that needs to be applied in the team, that we do not transform or ingest data within the BI layer. We are ultimately always querying where the data lives. So this is where the zero copy live query architecture becomes so important. Because if you do that, then you ultimately solve the difficult stuff in the cloud data platform that can be done by IT, ultimately. And then business users access a high quality analytics ready data set, and they are fast and self-sufficient without any way to slow them down effectively. Now, that becomes a paradigm, and I'm pretty sure you could achieve that with legacy BI as well by using it only for visualization only purposes without any modeling. But what is actually quite important is that you also select the right technology within BI or what it must deliver. So very important, I put in 4 factors, but I think just to reiterate the architecture, it has to be live query always. Whether that's a strict capability of a BI tool that it doesn't enable you to extract, that's ideal. Or if there is an extract, you've got to make sure it's not being used for this purpose. The other item is, and that's actually quite interesting, because if you start doing live query, you then start leveraging not just the compute power and the scalability of a cloud data source, but also everything else that comes with it. Security is inherited, or new workloads, working with Python, or nowadays also with LLM and Gen AI, that should all sit in the data store. The BI layer should always be the interface. It should not do its own computing. It should not do its own ingestion. You introduce complexity if you do so. As a result, it becomes so important that BI becomes extremely easy to use, so that business domains actually adopt it and know how to work with it, become self-sufficient. There's no point giving a heavy expression language or coding language-based visualization layer to the business domain. They'll do not have the technical skill, unless, of course, again, they bring in somebody who's specialized in that. But there's no reason, because if you're using a data source for doing all the heavy stuff, then the visualization layer can actually be quite easy. So truly no code is extremely important. Drag and drop, and very important, world-class visualizations and dashboarding, because it needs to look aesthetically pleasing, because that's when people trust the numbers and ultimately they use the product and you drive adoption. Semantic layer is important because even though the data product will be high quality, will be prepared, will be curated, there's always this last mile analysis need by business domains and business users itself, which is, I want to see a metric adjusted for a specific filter. I only want to see certain periods. You cannot pre-calculate all these permutations and variations ultimately in the warehouse as a individual data products. You need to enable a semantic layer that gives the business the ability to define their definition of their world with ultimate flexibility in there. So a semantic layer is an important part of a self-service BI tool that needs to be in place ultimately. There's a debate here as well currently in the market where the data source is building their semantic layers, and should not the semantic layer sit closer to the data source and the data warehouse? My argument is that there's many ways how that can be solved, but ultimately, if you want the business domain to own the semantic layer, then it has to be a no-code interface. It cannot require you to have SQL skills in order to build that. And last but not least, flexibility. And I think this is something what a lot of organizations miss, that you cannot have a point reporting BI solution that only does one thing well. For example, only dashboard. It has to be flexible enough, either by configuration, to become also a report scheduler, to be export to PDF, to Excel, and also have an interface to ask questions using Gen AI. But it cannot be one and not the other. You have to be able to offer all the various use cases, because eventually you will end up with a limitation and a point of friction where the business will then say, well, I cannot do this in the BI tool of choice. I have to then, worst case, export and do it manually in Excel, or they bring in another technology. And every time you have multiple technologies for consumption, you risk your governance and the thing between. Now, we have understood what needs to be happening with self-service BI. It needs to shift to the left. It needs to be suitable for a data mesh architecture. But more importantly as well, now we have to bring in data product thinking to the organization. And I think that's a little bit the hardest, but also the easiest part, because it's quite clear. What is a data product? When does it become a data product? And what levels of quality are there within a data product? And this is where the data medallion principle comes in, where this is where organizations classify data that is being raw, that is being ingested in its current form, and IT-owned is bronze. Then in collaboration with the business domain, they're working on standardizing it, applying consistent terminologies, clean up the data set. I mean, data quality cleaning is a huge, huge exercise, which then becomes silver. But it's not quite ready for consumption, because you need to ultimately blend it with a semantic layer and a definition layer, at which point you will have the gold layer. The gold layer is what you give access to your end users or any type of users to do self-service BI on, because ultimately that's the one that they trust in is analytics ready state. So as you progress, ultimately the data quality improves. IT's job is get to bronze fast, enforce rules for silver. The domain's job is take silver, put it into gold with context and metrics, and users can then ultimately do self-service through no-code BI. But that is all great in theory, you would say, and I completely agree. What about the elephant in the room? And the elephant in the room is Excel. Now, Excel is a copy of data that sits localized, worst case on your own desktop, maybe in the cloud as well, but is your own personal copy of a data set where users can do anything they want, change the numbers, enrich it, build reports. It is the most successful productivity tool, I would say, in the history of technology, and it's not going away. Yes, we want to obviously remove the need for Excel, and hopefully, a lot of BI use cases will ultimately mitigate the need for some of the manual work. But the reality, it is here, it will be there. And how does it play with the concept of data mesh, which banks and relies on a no copy architecture, when in fact you do have copies that are being created whenever you download to Excel. Well, there's no reason to not or to eliminate Excel, because it actually can work equally as much in parallel. What you would do is you would apply the same type of product thinking, but on an application layer. So let's say somebody exported an Excel from a BI dashboard. They need to do that. They want to build a model. They want to do a what-if analysis. Maybe want to change the numbers a little bit, or explore it, blend it maybe with some other mapping that they have in place. But they want to be able to be self-sufficient and productive without having to do that in a BI tool necessarily. Those use cases will exist, but that becomes then an individual bronze application that is recognized by both the users and ultimately the business domains. They can exist, there's no problem, but there's no support, there's no, you cannot rely on it, it cannot be used for certain things, and ideally, it should also not be shared with others or collaborated on. Shared, yes, but not collaborated on. So what the business domain then does is whenever you need collaboration and you need to streamline the work that somebody has done, because there's something valuable in there, you elevate it into a structured, ultimately BI report that is co-owned by the business domain, right? And that can then be used, it can live there, and as it becomes more critical and valuable, the business domain can then decide, you know what, actually we should put it part of our, gold report products, which again is owned by the domain. So the individual user is no longer responsible for that, but it has been elevated, been promoted to be part ultimately of the business domain's offering. And again, right, this is how you achieve self-service BI. So any export to Excel, report quality will be low. If you need it to be high, you then go it through the guardrails and you promote it ultimately to be part of the business domain. Now, the important fact in this is there's no IT involved. And IT doesn't need to be involved. There are some exceptions where if you want to bring in a new data set, you have to involve IT. But ultimately, if it's just a new variation of a report, you have the ability to ultimately do that fully independently at the speed that you need. And this is how the product thinking becomes such an important thing is in this paradigm. So one is the architecture, second is the technology, the product thinking. We agreed on the responsibility that moves to the business domain itself. So we have everything in place. Now, but how do you drive change ultimately in an organization? And the reality is that this is not going to be a seamless change. It's not going to be, like ChatGPT, I just opened up and I immediately adopted it because I didn't have something similar before. This is going to be a different, slightly different way of working where different rules need to be applied, governed, and followed. But more importantly, as I said, part of the responsibilities shift to a business domain. BI needs to start shifting left and moves the logic back into the data source. I mean, some people will be not open to this, and they will be ultimately be reluctant. So you will feel a lot of friction at the beginning, and some people call this the Shirky paradox, where the institutions that are creating products, they want to make sure that problems that they produce, they remain, so they have work to do. So how do you solve that? So you have to start small. You choose one business domain, you got to deliver value fast. Typically the one that has the biggest data need, maybe a new data source, but agility is ultimately the biggest promise of the data mesh architecture. And if you deliver results fast, others will just follow because they'll see this as a new benchmark. So that's important, but that's also not necessarily something new. The most important thing is shift incentives. So how do you convince somebody to move BI logic back into the data source if they're no longer the ones building the BI logic? They'll feel, threatened to some extent. They'll feel worried because they're not in control. But the reality is, this is going to be a short-term, I would say, expense, if I can call it this way, at a much bigger long-term gain. So the biggest issue that, as an example, BI developers have is the constant backlog of little requests. those little requests where can you add one more field, can you build one more visualization, can you create a new version or a new sheet, which are mundane, take a lot of time, they're not exciting, to be honest, and repetitive. And what this enables, if you achieve a self-service BI architecture, you can enable ultimately your users to be more self-sufficient, which will free up time so you can then work on more high-value, impactful projects and initiatives within your business domain, quite frankly. And I think that's important because there is so many new possibilities in the cloud. We not just want to replace the same reports in the cloud, but we want to leverage the new possibilities in the cloud from higher scale, from new use cases with Python, advanced analytics, and last but not least, Gen AI. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of more work that requires the attention of individuals than having to maintain existing reports, and this is how you get them ultimately along. And the other opportunity, and this is why we're pushing so hard, both with Astrato, but also with this webinar and the content, is that migrating to the cloud is a unique opportunity to use it as a reset. Do not just lift and shift into the cloud existing technology, hoping to just get scale and ultimately maybe a lower total cost of ownership. Use this opportunity because you start with a slightly clean slate to change things, be it different technology, something that has been innovative and been made and born in the cloud, for example, Snowflake, or Astrato ourselves as well, but also new paradigms on how we now work with data in the cloud should be differently. And that is the opportunity that you should use because it gives the ability to say, we're doing this the new way in the cloud versus the old way, maybe an on-premise world remain as it is, without creating conflicts effectively, but making it quite clear that if you want to modernize with us, you're going to modernize in a new way of working as well. And that offers, I would say, a unique opportunity for a lot of organizations, not just to modernize their infrastructure, but lay and create the foundations for the next 5 to 10 years to amplify what they're able to do with data and their business. So we discussed technology, we discussed the shift left from BI. It's not just technology and different terminology, but it's also a way of working. So you've got to get people on your way as well. And to achieve that, you need to get started effectively with the right incentives. And if you do get to the story where you have now a data mesh architecture and you have the right tooling and you have everything feeding off of a single source of truth, that's when the self-service paradox is solved, because users have data instantly, high quality data that they don't have to go to IT, but they can go to the domain, business domains. They can actually work with people who are responsible for their areas of the business on the data that they need, and they can move fast, very fast across their own domain, but also across different domains for a more holistic view. And IT moves back, but becomes super critical because they become the enabler. They create the infrastructure, the guardrails, the framework, and I would say for the first time, you would have the possibility to work together, aligned, and not tug against each other, but work together towards driving value for the business. What is a very competitive environment? So the freedom is solved with guardrails, which business users are happy with, and IT gets the control they want, but only where it matters, right? They don't need to be responsible for doing BI. It can be something that can sit within the business themselves. So agility and trust is what's the foundation and of a data-driven organization that moves fast. And to get there, this offers a very, very attractive, innovative framework. Again, paired with the right technology, you'll be able to, go extremely fast and have a lot of fun. Ultimately, I think a lot of people love working with data, actually. So it can actually become much more enjoyable to work. So every organization has products, and maybe it's time to treat your data like a product as well. And that's the last open question that I'll leave you with. I hope this was useful. If you have more questions, you can always ping me or ask right away. But this has been quite enjoyable to research, to see this evolution over the last 3-4 years. And being a data practitioner on the BI side, but also seeing how organizations are operating, I feel we are literally at a way where if we implement data mesh, at least the principles successfully, and IT and the business get to work together, great things will happen and it'll be extremely enjoyable to work. So with this, I say thank you for listening. We'll be producing more contents, blogs around that topic. So stay tuned. And yeah, hope you learned something new today with me.